Well, so CAA is here. It's real. It is the biggest opportunity. It's got a little compliance tied to it, depending on your perspective. Who do you want your clients to hear about it from? Mm. So we are doing our best to arm brokers to go do this, protect their clients, and grow.
Yep.
Which side of that conversation do you want to be on?
All right, guys. Hey, Spencer Smith here, host of the Self-Funded with Spencer podcast. We have a special episode today, which is kind of cool. I'm joined by Drew Kalestad as well as Tony Sorrentino. And we actually have a third guest who's off camera, who I will ultimately be bringing on for a second part of this episode. But today, for those of you that are listening only and not watching, we're going to have two guests sitting on the couch with me, and we're going to be peppering the conversation back and forth. And then we'll have Brian swap in for part two that will really wrap this entire conversation up. So really excited. This is a little challenge for me. I think it'll be a little challenge for the guests, but it's going to be a great conversation. So I've got Drew Kalestad as well as Tony Sorrentino. So Drew, why don't you tell us really quickly who you are and what you do, and then I'll pass it over to Tony as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Spencer. Thanks for having us on today. So Drew Kalestad, I'm a Chief Strategy Officer with Agility Innovation Partners. We're out of Denver, Colorado. I've got a little background of 30 years, 3 decades, being a benefits insurance broker, benefit advisor. Learned back in the day when I got to my clients started winning and it wasn't okay with the carriers, I knew something was wrong.
Okay, yeah. So that was your inception moment, right?
That was it.
Well, cool. And then we're going to come back to you, Drew. You're going to be the focus with Agility Partners of the first phase of the episode 1. Tony, how about yourself? Who are you? What you do?
My name's Tony Sorrentino, and I am the president of HP Fid, which is just an acronym for Health Plan Fiduciary Compliance. We're part of the Agility umbrella. And I'll jump into my background as a broker and as an attorney maybe when we get to more into the depth of the CAA.
Absolutely, yeah. And so how we're going to break this up for the folks that are listening at home, we're going to start with the Agility Partners, which is the umbrella for the CAA discussion we're going to cover, as well as the data analytics, which Brian will step in for part 3. So we're going to establish the kind of the what the problem here with Drew. Tony's going to talk about the legislative component with the CAA, and then we're going to tie it all together with how you use data to kind of solve this entire problem. This podcast is brought to you by True Captive Insurance, a premier medical stop-loss captive for employer groups ranging from 25 to 1,000 employees. True Captive believes in healthcare that is personal and insurance that isn't complicated. That's why they take a white glove approach, making it easy for employer groups to transition into a program built specifically for them. Check them out at truecaptive.com. This podcast is sponsored by PlanSight. PlanSight is a technology for employee benefits brokers to more efficiently manage their RFP process for any group size, all funding types, and over 20 benefit lines and point solutions. PlanSight is the only end-to-end RFP technology on the market today. Let's modernize your RFP process together. Check us out at plansight.com. So Drew, let's tee it up first. Agility Partners, you started going into that with your bio, and we had to do an abbreviated version. Tell me more of your backstory as a broker. You said about 30 years, ultimately what led you to here you are today. Give me a little bit more of your CV, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So again, had a career from being a small group broker, carrier at the very front end, learned the business there, and then a broker for 25 years. And really was trying to help our clients navigate to win and to keep healthcare affordable.
Okay.
That's what you do. When I learned that the system was not allowing us to do that, and that's when I really started to pause and examine what we were doing and how the system was wired.
Okay.
And realized that it's designed to do exactly what it's doing.
Well, that's what people say, right? It's not the system is broken. It's just been designed to do something different than what people presume is the case, right? So elaborate on that for me. What is the system doing that you think is suboptimal?
Well, it's interesting. There's 3 primary stakeholders, national health plans, pharma, and hospital systems in general. Those are the big 3 that are on the supply side and the financing side of healthcare. And the system has been designed with data, with intelligence to perform for those stakeholders.
Okay.
They finance sickness and so on. And then on the other side, the demand side, employers, brokers, employees, and families are on the other side trying to afford and put a frame around that financial structure to keep it affordable.
Okay.
So the system, it goes up and to the right. It has for 3 decades. It's never ebbed. So there is a solution. That's what we're here to talk about today.
Well, that's to say, I feel like we are ebbing, right? And that's where obviously Tony and the CAA is going to come into the fold, talking compliance under that umbrella of Agility Partners. So when did you become a recovering broker? When did we transition out of that world?
2017.
2017. And was there an exact impetus to make a change, or was it just a culmination of years of doing that?
You know, it was a combination. 3 decades doing anything is a lot. Thousands of renewal meetings with the outcome never changing. That took a toll.
Okay.
I needed a little shift, and then direct primary care was a really hot and emerging topic at the time, and I needed a little fresh air, so I went for that.
So you made a shift to DPC. Well, that I'm personally a big fan, and I think that'll absolutely move the needle in our industry.
Indeed.
It's almost mind-boggling that that's not the way that we have had primary care set up in the first place, but that's maybe goes back to those incentives that you were talking about before. What was it about when you heard of DPC or you became aware of it that you said, aha, I want to do that?
Well, when I realized the supply chain, that's a phrase I'll use a few times today, from primary care up through specialty care and diagnostics, outpatient, inpatient, that whole supply chain is controlled by the 3 stakeholders we mentioned. And so direct primary care is just taking it back a piece of control on the simplest part, which is just primary care. The last thing I'll say about that is we don't need to insure the simplest care.
Exactly.
We got an 18-wheeler of financial strength and a big insurance policy that might write $1 million check. We don't need the 18-wheeler for $30 expenses.
Well, and that's, I've heard somebody else position that, and I forget who, but it's you're effectively using insurance to pay for something that you should just be paying for out of pocket in the first place. Because at least in terms of the average cost of care, I'm not suggesting certain people don't have different incomes, but the average cost of care in the primary care setting versus an emergency style setting, insurance wasn't designed to pay for that, right? The little things, correct?
Correct. And so where the healthcare system, I believe, has lost its way for the member is that the supply chain, it starts with the primary care. So that's the entry to the system. And if you can get well and stay well there, you don't need the system. But the system is designed to pull you into the system.
Yeah, absolutely, right? It's like that just gets you there. Now where do we send you afterwards for the higher cost and fee-for-service style care? So Agility Partners, right? I know we want to cover that, and I definitely want to give you space to be able to describe what you guys are doing. So when was the inception of Agility?
About 3.5 years ago, my co-founder Ken Sloan and I came together. I had been journeying through various innovations, learning about different ways to solve the issues of healthcare. I realized I needed a friend. I needed someone, things are better together. So Ken and I launched Agility Innovation Partners and subsequently invited both Tony, Sorrentino, and Brian to join. So there's 4 of us today.
Okay. Tony, when did you join?
I joined about 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago. And Drew, did you recognize that we really needed a compliance expert, or what was the kind of the pulling of Tony in, and what was his purpose within Agility?
The aha moment was really realizing and respecting the Consolidated Appropriations Act and how it empowers plan sponsors and brokers to the keys to the kingdom. And Tony, he was very successful in building a firm over from X number of millions to X times through compliance.
Okay. Yeah. So Tony, and I will come back to you obviously for your full version of this, but so what was the recognition as compliance as an opportunity? Because that's curious. Most people think of compliance as something I have to do. Right. It seems like you realized it was an opportunity to win and grow.
We chose to use compliance to differentiate ourselves from our competitors. It wasn't something that the other firms that we competed with were, all that crazy about. And compliance isn't fun, it isn't sexy, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
So we chose that venue, whatever the law might have been HIPAA, might have been ACA, might have been CAA, to differentiate ourselves and try to win business doing something a little different than everybody else.
Well, and that's what, Drew, you were talking about this, is positioning what Agility is doing, obviously, is not, I have to do this. There's an opportunity here. So before we answer what that opportunity is, can you just 30,000-foot view Agility Partners, what you guys are doing? What is the value proposition for your firm? The
problem we solve is to help brokers protect and grow their revenue faster in the new era of CAA and transparency.
Okay. So seizing on that opportunity where people are looking at the CAA and going, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're scrambling, right? You recognize this, and I think you even tied this in when we talked earlier to the similar transition our industry went through with the ACA. A lot of people were panicking, and some people emerged out of that actually better for it. So how do you see this, this CAA compliance legislation actually giving new opportunity to new brokers and creating a new horizon, if you will, for a transition of our industry?
Indeed. The CAA is the sunlight dawning on our industry, and sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Agreed.
Where it's, not to be confused with the ACA, which to many is about a 12-year car wash of duties, right? And it's not very fun. The CAA, by contrast, replicates what happened in the retirement space 20 years ago.
Okay.
It went through a similar evolution of activating and empowering fiduciaries to take command of their 401k, their investments, all the pieces of their plan. The CAA for healthcare does the same thing that happened there. It's just now happening on healthcare.
Okay. Well, no, I think we would all recognize this as a good thing, or I think the intent is a good thing. There's always unintended consequences of legislation. But, I think I heard you before describe it, and maybe it was a quote from somebody else, that our industry is kind of like a tapeworm. So what did you mean by that?
That was a quote from Warren Buffett, obviously a brilliant man in our country's history here. He was once involved with Chase and Amazon in a venture they were going to get into healthcare. And he ultimately, they dissolved that, and when he left and he addressed his stakeholders about it, he said, healthcare is the tapeworm of our economy. Mm-hmm. It just keeps pulling very slowly. It just keeps robbing the Americans of the ability to save, put money aside for college. Mm-hmm. Healthcare is kind of robbing the American dream.
Okay.
All right, so...
And a tapeworm is just constantly consuming the food that this host is ingesting, right? And stealing from their metabolism to feed and grow. So who is I guess it's pretty obvious in that analogy who the winners and losers are, but the individual American is ultimately the one that's actually losing that equation, right?
Indeed. The villain in our story is the complex, non-transparent health system that is protected by contracts that protect that non-transparency. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And conflicts of interest that perpetuate those contracts.
Yeah, it's sort of the opaqueness between the payer and the provider as to what actually is appropriate charging, the charge master, billed charges, paid charges. I mean, these are all things that we cover quite a bit on this podcast. But why do you think we got here? Mm-hmm. And then how is the CAA and what you guys are doing going to undo that? So
there's a phrase, how do you boil a frog? And the answer is very slowly, right? So we got here a long journey. The system has been slowly designed to do what it does with middlemen and different intermediaries everywhere. What the CAA does, it's the keys to unlock the contracts that keep this undercover, and it opens the transparency on unit cost. Okay. Hospitals have to show their rates. Health plans have to show their contracted rates. So for the first time, a plan sponsor, otherwise known as an employer or a fiduciary, mm-hmm. has the opportunity to open up and see where the costs are and determine what's appropriate and start to take out what they don't need. Yeah, and it's changing or shifting healthcare consumption back to the way that we consume almost everything else, right? Mm-hmm. When I go and buy anything else, I know the price ahead of time. Healthcare is the only arrangement where I have to guess after the fact and wait for a bill and wait for another bill because that first bill was probably incorrect before I ever know ultimately what the charges are going to be to me, the member that needed the care itself. So that, I mean, I'll use the term bastardized. It's a very bastardized way to set up a financial arrangement, but here we are. And I always talk about, hey, this is a system that we're in. You can't burn it to the ground. Right. Some people want to, and not for not good reason. But if we can't burn it to the ground, how do we iterate ourselves out of this? How do we solve our way out of it? And I think that's obviously what Agility is setting out to do. So who is your client? Is this brokers? Is it the employer? Is it both? Who's ultimately engaging with you to use your services? The benefit advisor, the broker, consultant in the community. And what type of advisors are we working with? I imagine there's a profile, right? Indeed. So 15 or more years in the business. They know their way around the racetrack. Okay. They're thought leaders. Generally, they're fiercely independent. They haven't been acquired. They've advanced, and they're some of the smartest regional benefit leaders in the country. All right, and they know something's wrong and they want to fix it. And they've been trying to fix this for years and years. So the solutions we're bringing are to help enable them to do that quicker, faster, protect their revenue, and grow their business.
Yeah, and I'd imagine the Health Rosetta style advisor, not necessarily just to name them, and we've got folks at everything from Band to True Network Advisors, E-Powered Benefits, you name it. There's a lot of good, would you say, coalitions or organizations of disparate brokers that come together that all have a similar mission, recognizing the problem and wanting to do their part to fix it. So it sounds like that is a kind of a tailor-made potential partnership for you guys, correct?
Indeed, yes. The ones that are seeking a different outcome, and they realize, honestly, that the constructs of today, the PPO-centric arrangements, the non-transparent deals that we don't know about, to shift away, the only way to pay less for healthcare
is to pay less for healthcare.
Yeah,
yeah. I'm with you. I knew we were going to have a philosophical alignment here. So we kind of established the what, right? We've talked a little bit about the who. Now, how are we going about this? How is Agility going about solving this?
So we have three circles, three focus areas in Agility. CAA or compliance, and Tony will share more about that. Data analytics plays a big role. Data is the new currency of healthcare.
Okay.
So data, compliance, and then innovation.
Okay.
We ran ahead of the herd. There's some very cool innovations that help fix a lot of what we're talking about. So combining those three, put those three circles together, and that's what Agility does, and we help pass that through to a broker to use that to their advantage.
Yeah, so the collection of the data, making sure they're compliant and their fiduciary responsibility is being met, and then you have actual tools in your toolkit of what to execute now that we know there's a problem, or now we've identified specifically where we are non-compliant or we have opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about what those innovations entail?
Indeed. So on the innovation side, we partner with direct primary care, Nice Healthcare out of Minnesota.
Yeah.
Great model, very nimble, low cost, very powerful, virtual to in-home. Directs, which is a national digital pharmacy, low cost. It is what some of the big fancy names on fancy TV shows are trying to do in a cost plus method, but it's already available. So we find pharmacy and primary care and ways to get into the supply chain simply.
Yep.
Ultimately, direct contracting will be an evolution,
Okay.
but you don't start there.
And then what about at the member level? Is there anything that you touch on the individual human level, behavioral, preventative style? Is there anything we're engaging at that point of the spectrum?
Currently, no. Our focus is really empowering the broker to be the guide, the Indiana Jones, for their clients regarding the compliance and the data to change the script and change the outcome.
Well, and, I know we want to pull Tony in. He's been very patient and very diligent. He's waiting for his turn, and I know he's chomping at the bit to talk. But, where are we focused right now today? It's 2022. We're shooting this, at the end of August of 2022. We're coming on fourth quarter. What do we focus on specifically today at Agility?
My phrase, and then I'll toss it to Tony and how we use his expertise to do that. It's restoring hope in your clients that there's a better outcome due, and restoring energy to your team.
Okay. So not just your clients, but the folks that work within our industry that have probably been burned out quite a bit by what they see and what they do on a daily basis. So you're giving them energy because there's something new to solve for, and potentially I think something very big that we're solving for, right?
That is a fact. When they embrace this, they get energized, and there is indeed hope that this is the chisel and that can break the shackles that we've been under.
Okay, well, I'm excited to hear more, and let's unpack this from a compliance perspective. So, Tony, like I said, you've been very patient over there, and I appreciate you kind of hanging with us as we started off with Drew, and I know Drew will definitely want to engage throughout your conversation as well. Tony, we introduced you, but albeit very briefly, so why don't we shift into Phase 2, Act 2 of the CAA with Tony Sorrentino. Give me a little bit more of your background and how you ended up here today.
Well, by education, I'm a CPA and an attorney. Bridged from there eventually into the benefits arena. But most of my career was actually spent not practicing either of those. I was a practice leader for a large Midwestern consulting firm.
Okay.
And for about 32 years. And in my spare time, I've been an adjunct professor of law at Creighton University, speaking on topics related to ERISA law, but more specifically healthcare plans.
Well, in your other spare time, you were also a coach of a cross-country team
Creighton
as
University cross-country team. Very, very spare time.
Very, 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 very spare time,
Very, very
right?
spare
I don't know where you find all this time, but, we were talking health and fitness before, and, the mileage that you've put on is pretty impressive. You said you've probably put 100,000 miles on your body at this point in your career?
Yeah, and I have the artificial knees to prove it now.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Nobody's doubting you anyways, but I mean, it's pretty amazing that what you're able to do, just ultimately find the time to do those things. But where did the interest or where did the introduction to the CAA come from for you? And Consolidated Appropriations Act, I want to make sure we say that quite a few times as well so people know what we're talking about.
Well, as mentioned earlier, our practice was a little bit of a niche practice in that while a lot of other of our competitors certainly paid attention to legislation, we used it more of as a marketing tool, and we actually welcomed new legislation. We can go all the way back to the early mid-'80s and COBRA for that matter. But sometimes you need something to differentiate yourself, and we had a very technical staff, several CPAs and attorneys, and we used it as an opportunity. We would try to be out front to our clients and talk about legislation. A lot of it was very reactionary. Not every legislation is opportunity. The CAA came along really just 2 years ago, kind of a Christmas present, so to speak, December 27th, 2020. And the act itself is something like 1,100 pages.
Okay.
But about 91 pages of it, to be exact, is dedicated to the fiduciary responsibilities of a health plan, which, as Drew said earlier, kind of resemble what happened in the retirement plan area 20 years ago.
Drew brought that up, and I want to make sure for folks that aren't aware what happened in the retirement space, how are there parallels between that and the CAA?
In the retirement plan space, if you were a fiduciary, you worked for a large company who sponsored a health plan, there were really not a lot of obligations. It was very gray. It was wording like, make a good faith compliance effort, you're a fiduciary, make sure you utilize the prudent man rule, but there was no framework around it. And then all of a sudden, there were some lawsuits by plan participants because certain funds were heavily loaded or they weren't given the opportunity to invest in the right funds, weren't educated correctly. So laws came into effect that you as plan sponsors, you need to police this.
Okay.
You're responsible and fines will be assessed if you're not. Very similar to what's happened in the CAA. The CAA, which is a little more gray, there's a lot more players, there's insurance carriers and TPAs and network providers and PBMs, trying to harness all those into a way that a plan fiduciary, which could be your HR staff, could be your COO, you now have obligations. Compliance has always been a good idea. Now it's the law. And here we are 20 months later. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't understand that you're standing on the railroad track with a bag of money and the train's coming at you and you've got less than 4 months to do something about it.
Yeah.
So our interest in the CAA was married with what Brew talked about is we've got a problem in healthcare anyway. It's a little expensive. It's robbing ourselves of other things that we can and should be doing with our money. So it was really a law that was perfect timing.
Okay.
And
Did you anticipate it coming, though? I know you said sometimes these are reactionary. Did you see a little bit of the writing on the wall or no?
Honestly, I didn't. Okay. I spent 30 plus years, as did Drew, being part of the problem. We were both brokers. We looked at all these administrative agreements to put handcuffs on employers and rob them of their opportunity to get their own data. And while we knew the problem was there, we didn't really have any enforcement tools. And along comes the CAA and says, aha, we've always known the problem. Now we can do something about it through the other 1,000 pages of the CAA, which talks about transparency.
Yep.
So with transparency, we're enabled to now do something about our fiduciary concept.
Well, and so specifics of what we're solving for in terms of the CAA's legislation, pricing, like opaqueness of pricing, right, the cost of care itself, broker fees or compensation, whether it's direct or indirect.
Kind of a little touchy subject.
Yeah, kind of a little touchy subject, but it's part of it, right? That's part of it. And we're not necessarily making a judgment here of whether somebody's compensation is appropriate or not, but there's a recognition. There's a lot of compensation that's being dispersed, if you will, and not always disclosed, and so I think that's part of it as well. What else is being addressed? Anything else besides those elements?
If you had to break down CAA in its most basic format, there would be 4 pillars. You hit on one, that there's gag clauses, what they're referred to, in our administrative agreements which prevents plan sponsors from actually gaining their own data. And if you will talk to any insurance carrier, I'm not picking on any of them, many times the response is, well, it is your data, but once we adjudicate the claim and we've applied our network discounts, it becomes proprietary and you can't have it. That's no longer, it never really was the case.
Yeah, I was going to say, was that really the
But
case?
it was a convenient excuse and everybody believed it, including the brokers. That's gone now. The second piece would be, you mentioned broker compensation. And I want to be clear, it's not just brokers. It's any third-party provider to the health plan where plan assets are expended. So it could be, fees to a PBM or subrogation fees or third-party trade agreements, things that we didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
It's all of those fees. So problem number one is identify who's getting money out of the plan, because it isn't very clear. You might think you're paying just an ASO carrier to do all that. There's probably 4 or 5 other carriers in the background you don't know about.
Yeah.
The third pillar, if you would be more information about prescription drugs. And the CAA is very clear right now. It's basically 6 different requirements on generics and comparisons and cost comparisons that you have to be able to access as the plan fiduciary and turn around and make reports to the Department of Labor and HHS. The fourth one, very similar to PBMs and prescription costs, is costs associated with Mental Health Parity and Addictions Act.
Okay.
We all know mental health parity from 10 or 15 years ago. It's been strengthened and emboldened to take on some other things. That is a very difficult piece of information to get. We tell brokers to tell their plan sponsors that perhaps they even need to hire a third party there. It's a lot of analytics. It's very, very complex. But again, that needs to be reported to the triumvirate of the government agencies. Those are 4 things that didn't exist 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And
There's a lot of scrambling going on, right? And before we get into kind of the current state of affairs and probably the lack of adherence to their fiduciary responsibility for most part, Drew, I want to kind of let you weigh in on the CAA itself kind of globally. What is your opinion of it, and what do you think some of the positive outcomes that'll be derived from this?
Well, what I'd like to say first is everything Tony said is so powerful and important, and it's 10% of what the CAA was intended to do, which is if you do remove the gag clauses, you get access to your data, and you can do things with that data, right? So 10% compliance, 90% opportunity.
Okay.
So when a plan sponsor and a broker partner and can open up that shell, crack that egg, and they can start to do things they've never been able to do before. So the most important takeaway here is it's 10% compliance, 90% opportunity, and they don't even know what they don't know yet, what's behind the curtain.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest piece, is to don't put this into a jar or a box that's the ACA. This is a headache. This is the biggest single opportunity in 40 years in healthcare.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's necessary to at least expound upon the scope of this, why the opportunity is so great. I know a lot of people, there's some hyperbole thrown around and there's some fear mongering, which I don't think is necessary, but I do think it speaks to what I believe a lot of the industry thinks will be the outcome of this. But let's talk about current state of affairs, Tony. How many brokers are actually adherent out of 100 today that you think are actually adherent to the bylaws of this CAA?
Well, you would think the answer to that would be 90%, because we're 4 months away from the first big requirement that all plans, and I'm talking about all plans covered by ERISA, 2 lives, self-funded, fully insured, are going to have to make an attestation. And that attestation will say that we have made a good faith compliance effort to remove the gag clauses, therefore free up the information so we can fulfill our other fiduciary duties. But in reality, it may be less than 5% of brokers that have indeed an understanding of this and are out marketing this, if you will, or informing their plan sponsors that this is coming at you and you've got to do it.
Well, you say 4 months, so 1/1/23, I presume?
Actually, December 27th of 2022.
Okay.
Only because it's a 2-year anniversary of the CAA.
Okay, I see.
So
around Christmas, people are going to be really panicking.
Yeah. If you're HR, you don't want to take the week off between Christmas and New Year's.
Yeah, no kidding.
And all that really is an attestation that we've removed gag clauses, but, it's not up to we'll call it the Blue Cross or the Aetna or the Prudential to remove the gag clauses. This is a responsibility of the plan sponsor. And what I always told my clients, you can delegate responsibility. You can never delegate liability. If you don't do this, it's on you. Mm-hmm. Don't expect Blue Cross to send you a new ASO agreement and say, hey, we removed them all, life's good.
Yeah.
That's probably not going to happen. Same with your PBMs and same with anybody else. This is something you actively have to pursue, and you need to do it now. And that first attestation is actually for data back in 2020 and 2021, retrospective.
Okay.
That's an interesting piece of this law that most laws don't have. Most of the time it's prospective. This is not.
So this is retrospective, and if you change carriers or change arrangements over those 2-year periods, you've got multiple entities you've got to go to for this.
You've got multiple entities, and we'll talk later with Brian, but a lot of times plan sponsors aren't real good at documenting where they've been and why they've been there. So a data platform becomes very, very necessary because they can reach back and get the history, and you're going to need history.
Yeah, you're definitely going to need history, and you're going to need the what, right? Like, what is the data
What do
itself? Can I ask you though, because you mentioned down to 2 lives, if I'm a 5-life employer that has a fully insured plan, a traditional fully insured plan, what am I doing? Like, what do I do to get this information?
It's a great question, and a lot of that is going to be not the responsibility, but the data that you have is by your carrier or your prior carriers. And it still doesn't relieve the employer from asking the questions that they need to ask. They'll still need to do that. We're hopeful, but this is all new, that the carrier will give them enough information that they can at least sign an attestation and say, we made a good faith compliance effort.
Okay.
And I can't stress enough that, where will the government agencies be on enforcement of this? There are heavy penalties. But this first go round, I think there has to be an understanding that this is a little bit new, but you can't overlook this. The biggest mistake I think brokers or plan sponsors are making is this is going to go away.
Assumption that it just
this
fizzles
is
out.
not going away.
What do you think, and I'm just speculating here, but the notion of hiring 87,000 new IRS agents has anything to do with maybe some enforcement around this?
I would like to think that.
Okay.
But I really don't know.
I mean, you're getting into kind of political speculation, but it seems to be like we need some manpower in order to actually investigate and enforce this, and so perhaps that's some of the motivation there. Who knows?
That would be clear thinking.
Okay, that what you think so? Wink, wink, nod, nod. All right, so tell me about HP Fid though, because I didn't want to gloss over that. I know that's who your actual organization. Okay. So what is that, and what do you guys do specifically?
Our goal, and HP Fid fits under the agility umbrella of one of our services. Our goal is to work strictly with the brokers that you've identified, and we do it in 3 phases. We want to educate the broker because a lot of the mid-sized brokers don't have in-house counsel or risk counsel, so we will educate them on all the pillars that are associated with the CAA, and there's more coming, but this is just for 2022. And then after give them a good foundation, a good elevator speech if we want, we engage them in a more detailed way to help their plan sponsors have a fiduciary process. There needs to be a process to go out and ask for this information. You got to identify the parties. You have to know what to ask for. And then you have to have a methodology to procure that information.
Yeah.
So we teach them the process. And then the third phase of us engaging with our brokers is we're going to give you the tools to do it. How do I go to Aetna or Pruitt and what do I ask for? So we've developed templates that will help them, once they've identified the parties, to go out and procure the information and then bring it back. And of course, there's another phase of what do we do with it when we've got it. If that broker so chooses, we would assist them co-brand webinars with their prospects, with their clients. We'll help them do webinars, and then we're the back room for any questions that come up. And questions will come up. So our expertise is being the technical support for the broker. We do not engage with their clients.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So you go through the broker channel and help them work on behalf of their clients.
Being a broker for 30 years, I never wanted anybody in front of my client but me.
Totally understand. And whether or not their role, your opinion on the role as a gatekeeper is appropriate.
Right.
I do think there's a reason why they effectively triage on behalf of those employers, because otherwise they might be inundated with all sorts of solutions and not really know how to make heads or tails of those things. So the broker, again, any brokers, consultants that are listening, your role is absolutely valuable in the equation. And I genuinely never think that they'll fully be removed from that situation at all. I think their role will actually become more important over time.
Right.
So you're going through the broker, not the plan sponsor, but what about the goal, right? We're just helping them make them compliant. You mentioned some templates, kind of action plan. It's just really to ensure they actually have, they're armed with the ammunition they need, if you will, in order to go about being compliant, right?
We feel very strongly, Drew and I and Brian, that being in that broker business for a long time, if you don't educate your client, somebody else will. And You could look at the CAA in a lot of ways, but we look at it both as a retention tool. You need to be out there. You need to be first. And secondly, it's also a way to gain more business. Because as I said, 5% of the brokers are doing this. The other 95 will get there, maybe if you get there first. So it's both retention and marketing. And the two things that as a broker that you're concerned about is keeping the business that you work so hard to get and then adding a little bit every year.
Yeah.
That's a successful broker.
Well, and that's why I think the role will become more important over time, as I was suggesting, is because responsibilities for them and what's required of them to do a good job on behalf of their clients is going to continue to evolve. And this falls well in line with that book. And they really are morphing from broker into truly a consultant on behalf of their clients rather than just shopping insurance lines. That nomenclature I'm seeing kind of get thrown by the wayside a little bit because it underrepresents, I think, what their responsibilities are. And again, I'm always very clear. I am pro-broker by every stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely.
But we're just trying to make sure that they're well positioned and that their reputation and what they're doing on behalf of their clients meets the standards that they're expected to meet. Did you want to add something to that, Drew? Yeah.
I would like to. So when I shared a moment ago about the villain in our story, which is really the non-transparent nature of healthcare and the contracts that lock it down. So the CAA opens both of those doors.
Okay.
And so to the brokers who are advising their clients, these are the ruby slippers. These are the keys to the data kingdom.
Okay.
To unshackle those elements, those black boxes that have been locked down. And when you open those up, there is massive hope to have a different outcome, which is affordable.
Well, that's
healthcare.
what Tony said. A lot of these carriers will push back and say, "No, it's my data now because I've adjudicated a claim and applied my discounts." I mean, I think that's farcical in my opinion that that's the case. But I'm sure they have some sort of legal argument they've been able to leverage in order to be able to hoard some of that data. But I think that really what it comes down to, right? Is it's been such under lock and key, like you said, Drew, for so long that people have been kept ignorant about kind of how this equation plays out.
They've been conditioned to believe they can't do it.
Okay. Well, there is another way. There is a better way, which is obviously what we're talking about. So kind of what specifically, Tony, let's kind of land the plane on the part one of this podcast. CAA specifically, what do I need to do today if I'm an employer or a broker on behalf of my employers to be sure I'm taking the right steps right now to try to be compliant by December 27th?
Number one, if you haven't already as a broker been in front of your clients, I would at least have the elevator speech ready to say, hey, this is out there. It's been developing over the last 20 months. We're coming to a point where we need to talk in depth about formulating a process. The process at this point doesn't need to be perfect, but there has to be the effort. And, in baseball terms, if a ball goes between second and short and you stand there, it's an error. But if you at least make an effort, that's going to be recognized by the triumvirate of agencies that, okay, there was an effort there, and maybe penalties don't ensue.
Okay.
Well, first thing we want to avoid a penalty and a fine. Penalties are heavy.
What are they going to be?
$100 per day per employee.
Okay.
So if you have 1,000 employees, $100,000 a day.
Good.
Interestingly enough, the penalties for the providers, the hospitals, the doctors, et cetera, for non-compliance with the transparency rules was $300 a day. So the heavy pockets got much and the lighter pockets get a little.
Yeah.
We want to avoid that.
Okay.
Second and third steps, or let's get past the end of the year because the compliance aspects of CA grow every year. This is not a one and done. And then we use it, as Drew was talking about, it's 10% compliance but 90% opportunity. You're sitting on a gold mine. Blow the dust off and you won't believe what you're going to find.
Yeah.
So let's get through the 10% part here in the next 4 months.
Yeah. So we'll obviously make sure we're at least checking the box, like you said, making the good faith effort to do so. Can you quantify some of the impact? Well, actually, let me go back to something because I don't want to gloss over the fact that you just said it could be $100,000 a day for 1,000 life employer.
Yes.
You could bankrupt an employer with these fines very easily, right? If it goes on for a month or you say they look retroactively, hey, you haven't been compliant for 2 years, right? Are they going to bankrupt employers because of this?
It's possible. The question becomes then, where will the enforcement land? And you mentioned there's 87,000 new IRS agents. Enforcement in ERISA areas hasn't been over the top, but there's a lot of articles and a lot of high-level thinkers that's saying, in order to make sure that this isn't taken for granted, that the Department of Labor is looking at some Fortune 50 Fortune 100 companies, and they're going to make an example of this.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're a fiduciary, what is your biggest fear? You will be lamed in a lawsuit by your plan participants for not allowing them to have their fiduciary rights, because they're the only people that have rights, and that's the plan participants and their beneficiaries. That is as bad as $100 a day times employees. You don't want to be in a plaintiff lawsuit.
Yeah,
You aren't going to win.
Yep. Well, and I can't imagine, right, that the idea, at least the original intent behind this legislation, was to kind of provide transparency,
Right.
open up the black box, if you will. But it seems like the employers are being punished for being made to be adherent to this, right? Like, it seems like a pretty perverse punishment channel, in my opinion.
The brunt of the penalties, unfortunately, goes to the plan sponsors trying to do the right thing for their plan participant and not for some of the players.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is what it is, right? So it's our jobs to help sort of arm people to be able to react to this. So what kind of closing thoughts for both of you guys? We're going to end sort of part one of this where we talked agility and we talked CAA. So Drew, I'll kind of start with you. How would you like to summarize this episode before we focus on data with Brian on part two?
Well, so CAA is here. It's real. It is the biggest opportunity. It's got a little compliance tied to it, depending on your perspective. Who do you want your clients to hear about it from?
Mm.
So we are doing our best to arm brokers to go do this, protect their clients, and grow.
Yep.
Which side of that conversation do you want to be on?
Yeah.
So if you're on the good side, we think you can protect your clients and you can go, because there's a lot of people that are sitting on their heels.
Yep.
So who do you want your folks to hear it from?
Perfect. What about you, Tony? Why don't you kind of help me wrap up the CAA compliance piece as well?
While there is cost associated with compliance, and there always is and there always will be, the opportunities far outweigh that. If you take a 50-life group that you're able to inure to because you know something the other brokers do, you've more than paid for it. Don't look at this as a cost. Look at it as an opportunity, because it really is. We grew our practice that way, and a lot of other brokers will be able to do the same.
Well, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you gentlemen joining me and kind of exposing the problem along with me. So, Drew, I know you're going to stick around for part two of this, so I won't say goodbye to you just yet. But, Tony, really appreciate you opening my eyes about the compliance piece. People have been mentioning CAA to me for a while, and I never really fully understood the extent of its impact, and I still think we'll figure that out over the next couple of years. But really appreciate you, both of you gentlemen, helping me wrap the problem up, if you will. And then for those of you that are going to stick around for part two, Brian Bankin, he is going to talk data analytics, and it's now what do we do once we get the data to make sure we're compliant, but this is probably where we talk about the opportunity as well. So make sure to stick around for part two, guys. Appreciate it.